When you think about evolution, one name probably pops into your head, right? Charles Darwin. But what if I told you the story we all know is missing a huge piece of the puzzle? There was another man, a guy whose incredible journey almost made Darwin a footnote to his own theory.
So let's just get right into it. The question of who really discovered evolution? Well, it's not as simple as opening a high school textbook. This is a story about two brilliant minds working on opposite sides of the world, whose lives were about to crash into each other in a way that would change science forever.
So, picture this. You've got two British naturalists, both completely obsessed with the same giant mystery. Where do new species actually come from? They didn't know it, but they were in a race to solve one of the biggest puzzles in the history of science.
Okay, so in one corner you have Charles Darwin. He's a man of means, a gentleman scientist. He's working out of his comfy country estate in Kent, with all the time in the world to slowly and very secretly piece together his big idea. For 20 years, he works on it.
And then, in the other corner, you have Alfred Russel Wallace. His story could not be more different. He comes from a much humbler background, with very little formal schooling. He's a self-funded collector, which means he has to trek through the most dangerous jungles on Earth, catching exotic animals and insects just to sell them back in England to fund his research.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Just look at the contrast here. Darwin has family money, a university education, and the respect of the scientific establishment. Wallace, he's got none of that. He's literally funding his work sale by sale. This difference is going to define everything, especially the kind of risks each of them had to take.
See, this isn't just a fun fact about their backgrounds. It's absolutely crucial, because it led to two totally different kinds of courage. Both men were incredibly brave, for sure, but the things they were afraid of, well, they were worlds apart.
Darwin's courage was all intellectual. His biggest fear wasn't, getting eaten by a tiger. It was getting eaten alive by his peers. He was terrified of what he called public obloquy. Basically, the shame and outrage he knew his theory would cause. That fear is what kept him quiet for 2 whole decades.
Now, Wallace, his reality was something else entirely. He wasn't worried about what people would say in some London drawing room. He was worried about surviving the next day. The man faced constant life-or-death situations. On his way home from the Amazon, his ship caught fire. He lost his entire collection, everything he'd worked for, his entire fortune, and was left floating in the middle of the Atlantic for days. This was a man who physically risked it all for science.
So you've got Darwin hesitating in England for years, and Wallace literally fighting for his life in the Malay archipelago. And then it happens. A single piece of mail arrives at Darwin's house, and what's inside is about to spark a full-blown crisis.
Just to give you a sense of Darwin's panic, look at this timeline. He first came up with his theory way back in 1838. He even wrote it down in the 1840s. His friends were telling him, "Charles, you gotta publish this." But he kept waiting, and now, in June of 1858, that ticking clock just ran out.
So who's the letter from? You guessed it, Alfred Russel Wallace. And it contains a short, brilliant essay that perfectly lays out the theory of evolution by natural selection, the exact same idea Darwin had been sitting on for 20 years. Darwin was absolutely horrified. He felt his entire life's work, his honor, his whole legacy was about to go up in smoke. He'd been scooped.
So what do you do in a situation like that? Well, Darwin didn't act alone. He immediately wrote to his very powerful, very well-connected friends, Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker. And, being part of the establishment, they quickly cooked up a plan to manage the situation. And their solution was a masterclass in Victorian politics. Here's what they did. They took Wallace's paper, tacked on some of Darwin's old, unpublished notes, and presented them together at a meeting of a fancy scientific club, the Linnean Society. The move was genius, really. It made sure everyone knew Darwin had the idea first while still giving Wallace credit. They called it reasonable if rough justice.
And here is the truly ironic part. On July 1st, 1858, one of the most revolutionary ideas in the history of human thought is finally unveiled. And the reaction? Pretty much nothing. Crickets. The paper just landed with a thud. It seems the world just wasn't quite ready for it yet.
But even though that meeting was a total dud, it was the starting gun. The rough justice that was handed out that day pretty much decided how history would remember these two men. It would cement one as a legend and turn the other into a footnote.
For Darwin, that letter from Wallace was the ultimate kick in the pants. It was the cure for 20 years of procrastination.
Realizing he had nearly lost everything, he started writing like a man possessed. And just 17 months later, his masterpiece, On the Origin of Species, was published.
And this is how it all shook out. When the dust settled, Darwin's name became the theory itself. We call it Darwinism. He's known as the father of evolution. And Wallace, the guy who risked his life and came up with the same idea all on his own, he became the co-discoverer, a brave also-ran.
But here's the most incredible part of the whole story, and it really speaks to Wallace's character. He wasn't bitter at all. In fact, he became one of Darwin's greatest defenders. Years later, in 1889, he published his own book about the theory. And what did he title it? Darwinism. He actively helped build his friend's legacy, even at the expense of his own. It's an almost unbelievable act of class.
Okay, so why are we talking about this story from over 150 years ago? Because it is a powerful, powerful cautionary tale for any innovator, any creator, any scientist working today. The story of these two guys isn't just about biology. It's about the very nature of discovery and innovation. And it forces us to ask some really tough questions about what it takes to not just have a great idea, but to actually see that idea change the world.
So let's break down what we can learn here. First, Darwin's story screams at us that procrastination is the enemy. You can't sit on a brilliant idea forever. Second, the gentleman's solution proves that networks and privilege can completely shape who gets the credit. Third, we see that courage isn't just one thing. There's Darwin's intellectual bravery and Wallace's incredible physical courage. And finally, and maybe most importantly, their stories prove that having a great idea is just the starting line. It's not enough.
Which leaves us with this final, challenging question. The story of Darwin and Wallace makes it impossible to ignore the messy reality of how things get done. It's a mix of genius, yes, but also timing, courage, luck, and the connections you have. It's a timeless reminder to ask ourselves, is a great idea on its own ever truly enough?